frenzied, schizophrenic, pulpy, absurd, absolutely bloody insane. Any of these terms are decent descriptors to Crank 2 High Voltage, and yet none of them come close to properly conveying the experience of watching this movie. If you hadn't caught on yet, I went to see Crank 2 High Voltage at a particularly nice 19 plus VIP lounge, mind you, and I haven't recovered yet. The movie starts off with a bang and almost never stops to take a breather. Let's break it down a little, though. It'd be more interesting. The story, as if it really mattered in a movie like this, is that Chev Chelios, Jason Statham's character, manages to live after falling hundreds of feet from the air out of a helicopter in the previous movie, but is captured by the Triads and kept under by surgeons so they can extract his enormously powerful heart, which can withstand virtually anything, as well as harvest his other impressive organs. If you hadn't seen the first movie, don't worry. It's not that big of a deal. You'll miss the hilarity of some bits, but they mostly gesture towards the audience as to what happened and why you'll get it anyway. I don't want to spend too much time expositing on the story because, one, I don't want to spoil anything further, and two, it really doesn't matter all that much. The story was a throwaway in the first movie and is equally so here. It's largely just an excuse for the craziness of the movie to ensue. That's not a problem when the movie's all about the action, though. And let's face it, Jason Statham movies always are. One special thing to note about the Crank series, though, is that the story, and this is especially true of the sequel, is so over the top that it is purple. In all honesty, I thought I had seen some bizarre things in my time, but I was wrong. At least I hadn't seen what truly bizarre was. Granted, at the very least, it follows a linear plot structure, but everything else about this is as odd as one could get. From throwbacks to 70s exploitation movies, which this basically is, the premise itself, an entire proper kaiju fight harkening back to the old Godzilla vs. King Kong movie or War of the Gargantuans, the NES-like portrayal of the opening to the hypercharged cam work that is the equivalent of having a controlled seizure, Crank 2 High Voltage defies virtually all description. The story, for what it is, provides adequate, again if absurd, reason for the proceedings, and even has a few twists that I did not see coming. I doubt anyone could. The movie only gets crazier as it goes along and culminates in the most ridiculous scene I've ever witnessed. I won't spoil anything, but audiences owe it to themselves to find out what I'm talking about. If you're a fan of the first movie, the story will more than suffice. The acting itself is largely unimpressive, but suits the purposes of the over-the-top nature of the film. Thankfully, everyone is in on the joke, unlike some other poorly done movies. Jason Statham plays, well, Jason Statham, as in every other movie he's in. Which is not a bad thing, but he's basically a one-note action character. I will admit that while I don't think his acting chops are really up to snuff enough to play any other role, he does have a certain amount of charisma and a physicality to him, and is certainly easy to cheer on in the role. Kudos to him for doing what he does best. Amy Smart as Chev's girlfriend, reprising a role from the first film, does a better job than before, though I attribute this more to the director's larger vision for her character than her own acting. A ditz, but not completely brain-dead like she was before. Each of the main villains within the film do a decent job as well, specifically the actor who plays the Fariot, a particularly hilarious stereotype. Otherwise, Venus, Chelios' physically handicapped sidekick, and Poon Dong, played by David Carradine, and well, his name basically tells you all he needs to know. Overall, they're pleasing, but certainly nothing will win any actors any accolades. Why should you watch this movie then? The story is insane, but nothing overly complex, and the acting is just okay. Why should you watch this movie? For the action, of course. And if you go into this movie expecting just a lot of kick-ass action, then you won't likely be disappointed. The movie, if you see the first entry in the series, is run entirely around one long action sequence. It literally almost never stops. And it all culminates in one of the most gloriously and gruesomely satisfying climaxes seen in the last little while. Anyway, from car chases, man versus car, that is, as it should be expected from a movie this ridiculous, gunfights, fist fights, and everything in between, Crank 2 High Voltage should definitely suffice. The frenetic camera style only helps in pumping up the audience as much as the movie's protagonist. That, in turn, leads us to the final category of this review, the technical bits. And these are actually particularly interesting. This movie was produced on a budget of less than $13 million, but the way the movie is cut would make it seem and suggest much more. While the effects themselves aren't very good, they don't necessarily need to be, as this is not your usual mega-budget action pick. Instead, the movie shoots for the look of a grindhouse film of times gone by. In that effect, it achieves its purposes. The film quality itself is good, but certainly not as good as regular film stock. However, the style of quick editing and mixing of said styles hides this fact and falls in line with films like 28 Days Later, which also uses hand cams. While it's hard to describe the editing style in the movie, I would say the closest equivalent would be like having a seizure, but in a good way. If you want to get sick at the movies, this may bother you. However, if you can stomach it, then it's a visceral method of immersing you within the constant onslaught of action that the directors throw at you. This should not influence your enjoyment of the movie, though. What matters is that the editing style works, and makes the film much better than it otherwise would have been, and the physical effects, which are the type most used here, are convincing. On the audio side of things, we have an equally eclectic mix of techno, hard rock, and even a bit of J-pop and choir thrown in for good measure. Much like the movie, the soundtrack is off-kilter, and yet it all suits the situation perfectly, in its own odd way. I really like the ambition the soundtrack showed, though. It's daring and something I definitely want to see more of. Mike Patton is the composer, and while I'm not intimately familiar with many of his works, I'm tempted to seek them out for his musical prowess. He's not the best, but experimental and pleasing, a good mix of both. In conclusion, Crank 2 High Voltage is a quirky, to say the least, action movie that harkens back to the exploitation genre, and in many ways, almost seems like an effort to bring it back in force. The story is preposterous but highly entertaining in its absurdity. The acting is amusing but nothing incredible. Thankfully everyone is in on the joke and just their roles accordingly. And the action is the main draw and should win most action fans if they can suspend their disbelief indefinitely. Lastly, the camera work is fascinating and draws you in if you don't get dizzy easily. And the soundtrack is an equally perplexing mix of genres that somehow all fit into a cohesive whole. So, would I recommend this movie? Yes, I would. While it's not for everyone, in fact it's only for a very small sect of people, it's an interesting technically and a crowd pleaser if you can appreciate its insanity. If you can't, however, leave realism at the door, you will not enjoy this movie, and I advise to stay far, far away.